Okay, a couple of purposes completed, maybe not, we'll see. One, of course, to help you develop reading and reflection skills in every situation. But we're not communicating a set of rules you must memorize and adhere to. We're assuming if you're an AICP member, you have access to both code and the principles of APA, and we will give you the reference for the Nevada Code of Ethical Nevada Ethics. So, with that, we're going to let Fred give you some context on water ethics.
Thank you, Mike. I'm actually going to use the mic that is working for the most part, as this is, I think, the 20th time I'm up here today. My voice is just about ready to go. So I think I'll stick with the mic with the major amplification. As you all know, my name is Fred Steinman. I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. And in addition to the work I do as the chapter secretary and as the director of the Nevada Leadership Program and part of the University Center for Economic Development, and some of you will probably snicker and laugh, also teach the Business and Administrative Ethics class in the College of Business at the University of Nevada, Reno. And the material that I'm going to share with you today is really material that Dr. Terry Cooper, a professor of administrative ethics at the University of Southern California, has developed and kind of codified in his research for the International City County Managers Association, as well as the American Society for Public Administration. The reason I kind of like using Dr. Cooper's work is that after 40 or 50 years or so of studying administrative ethics and trying to get a theoretical as well as practical wrapping around what ethics is, he decides to essentially reject the kind of traditional approach we take to leadership, and makes the argument that administrators need to be responsible to and accountable to others in the organization, but also responsible for others within the organization and the conduct of the organization. And in order to fill that responsibility of being ethical and responsible administrators, managers, and ultimately professionals within the public sector, we really have to kind of separate out the concept of morality versus the concept of ethics. And he develops this definition of ethics as simply really a way to resolve individual conflicts that may arise when they present themselves. Typically, I like to view, based upon Cooper's work, an ethical dilemma as a choice between two equally good or two equally bad choices, but we are forced to choose. It is not an ethical dilemma when confronted with the choice to murder or to not murder. We have hard and fast legal standards, which can be considered moral minimums, but we have clear and definitive moral standards in our society, a Western society based upon largely Judeo-Christian and British common law teachings. It is immoral to take the life of another human being, regardless of the situation, with certain exceptions based upon the context of the particular situation that we are choosed from. An ethical dilemma, however, from an administrative standpoint, may arise based upon the different roles and responsibilities you face as an individual. The good example that Cooper gives in his book of an ethical dilemma is a manager of a utility district, and knowing that exposure to the water of a reservoir that the utility district is administering may lead to certain health and human safety concerns. And after time, after individuals have used that reservoir for recreational activities, they begin to exhibit the conditions and symptoms of being exposed to a particular bacteria that may exist in that reservoir. And all the testing in the world is done, and there's never ever any evidence that that bacteria was there and is the source of those syndromes. And you have been ordered by your boss, the executive director of that company, utility company, to not release information to the public. And now you're confronted with an ethical dilemma as a professional in the public service. Do I leak information to the press and to the public and say, there is a possibility that exposure to that water and that reservoir is leading to the health and human safety concerns? Or do you remain loyal and to your professional training to maintain discipline within kind of the structure of the organization itself? And now there is all of a sudden a conflict between these two different responsibilities and roles. The responsibility I have as a professional and as a public servant to provide information to the public that they may need in order to make decisions on their own, versus the responsibility and the obligation I have to the chain of the command, that exists within the organization itself. So we can think of morality as those hard and fast rules of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, whereas ethics kind of gets into the world of developing a rational tool of attempting to resolve conflicts that we face. Another way to kind of think about ethics is that ethics allows us an opportunity to rationally question what is meant and why. Why is it that I, as a professional within my organization, a municipality, a county, or another public entity, why am I asked to submit to the proper chain of command? So kind of think about yourself as kind of a mid-level planner. You have been in the organizations for, say, 10 years, and you're now taking on some administrative and managerial responsibilities in addition to your continued obligations to perform various planning functions. You, however, are not the head of the organization. You may not even be the head of the planning department, and there will be a planning director and potentially a city or county manager, and then ultimately an elected body within that chain of command that you are required to essentially conform to. Why do you think, and I'll throw it out to anyone here, that chain of command exists? Why can't we just make decisions on our own when we think it's in the public's best interest?
Have someone be held responsible for the action.
Absolutely. In our democratic society, the individuals most held accountable directly by the public are the elected officials. That is the contractual relationship between the organization, a municipality, and the public, and the voting public, in that the accountability is directly tied to the elected officials and even potentially a city or county manager and the elected body. And as a quote-unquote bureaucrat, I am there to essentially follow and implement the direction that the public and the city council or county commission have set. And that chain of command exists in order to maintain those democratic principles, as opposed to having just a non-elected technical expert begin to decide what is right and what is wrong in terms of what they feel is in the public's best interest. But if I have information as a technical expert that I think is most needed by the public to arrive to a decision, why wouldn't it be acceptable for me just to run to the press and say, here's the information? Doesn't the public have the right to know? Yes, no. Yeah, it could potentially violate the chain of command, but I may also have that obligation as a public servant to serve the public's best interest. But here again, I have a conflict between those two individual choices. So ethics not only provides us a rational and logical and methodical way of resolving these potential conflicts between two equally good or two equally bad choices, but it also provides us a way to understand and really discuss the moral status of different agencies and entities and organizations within the public sector. In kind of thinking about what ethics ultimately is, and this is relevant from the discussion of the development of a code of ethical standards, we can think about ethics as more of an analytical tool, again designed to help us resolve those conflicts that arise. And I can pretty much guarantee spend any time working in an organization, and eventually you as an individual will be forced to choose between, again, two equally good or two equally bad choices, and you're essentially forced to make a decision, as opposed to kind of falling upon hard and fast moral rules as a way to essentially resolve the conflict. Another kind of way of thinking about this is the conflict that may exist or arise between different competing moral rules. Think about your own personal relationships with a significant other, a spouse, or a coworker, or friends and other family members. Is it generally accepted amongst this group, yes or no, that it is critical to be honest to those people that we have an intimate relationship with? Yes. Right? We would assume as a moral tenet that in order for relationships to be healthy, that we need to be honest with those people that we have an intimate relationship with. Should we be brutally honest, however? Probably to a certain degree, no, and I'll put this example out to most of the gentlemen in the room. Think about your significant other and the question that will eventually arise one day. Honey, how do I look in this outfit? What is the one answer that you are expected to provide? You look great. Exactly. Even if you think that absolutely not, you should turn around, go back upstairs and try again, because that is just awful and I really don't want to be seen with you in public. You being brutally honest in that case, which would be required in order to maintain that moral requirement of being honest in an intimate relationship, would likely cause more harm than good in that situation. And instead, the moral principle and the moral expectation to protect the feelings and to provide support and sympathy and understanding to those that are in intimate relationships with us is going to take precedence in that case. But I violated the moral principle of remaining honest in intimate relationships by telling that person what they needed or what they wanted to hear to maintain the positive relationship. Here I have a conflict of moral principles, and it is the ethical, analytical tool that allows us the resolution. And in order to kind of weigh or judge which moral rules to apply, I use a simple criteria. And in this particular case, I have selected a criteria of trying to do the least amount of damage. And I've assessed that the white lie of simply saying, you look great, let's head out to dinner, let's go to the movie, let's go out for the evening, is going to result in less damage, especially if it's found out that maybe I wasn't being completely brutally honest, than being brutally honest and essentially crushing another human being's spirit. So it is the ethical tool that allows us to weigh the competition between different moral rules. It is critical to also understand that ethics should not be thought of as a shield or a coat of armor to protect you from the consequences of engaging and behaving in expected moral ways as well as expected ethical ways. As you'll hear from the rest of the panel today, living up to the expectation in, say, the AICP Code of Administrative Ethics or other codes of ethics may actually personally cost you in terms of your professional development and your professional rise within an organization. The AICP Code of Administrative Ethic, as well as many other professional codes, requires you as individuals to report violations to the code, to essentially become a whistleblower. And I don't know about you, but I don't know a single job out there that doesn't require a degree of loyalty and being able, to keep kind of the dirty laundry of the organization internal to the organization. But if I'm found to have not reported, a violation of the code to the organization that I'm a professional member to, I face potential sanctions, potential expulsion from the organization, thereby limiting my ability to advance in my career. On the flip side of it, if I live up to the code and engage in the ethical expected way and blow the whistle and report it, I could very well be terminated from my job. And yes, there are whistleblower laws out there protecting from retaliation, but that's not the reality of the world. If I wanted to terminate an employee, it wouldn't be hard for me to come up with some reason that would be defended in a court of law. And this is the real fundamental challenge we have as professionals, that living up to the high ethical standards of our professional association sometimes runs afoul of the expectation that is a condition of employment as well. Ultimately, this is a very personal and very intimate decision that you have to make as an individual as to the compromise that you're going to make, as opposed to the degree of punitive punishment that you may receive living up to a particular ethical code and expectation of action. There are a number of ways that we can essentially work our way through an ethical dilemma. And Terry Cooper kind of outlines these four levels of ethical reflection, saying that from the perspective of addressing ethical dilemmas, we, for the most part, resolve those ethical dilemmas at either an expressive or a moral rules level. At an expressive level, we tend to resolve the ethical dilemma by our gut feeling. How do we feel? You know, we may express frustration, but the degree of the ethical conundrum or dilemma is so limited in its severity that a simple gut reaction is all we need to do to react or respond and choose between the various choices we're forced with. We rely on our past experiences to provide us a framework or that intuition needed to resolve an ethical dilemma. The vast majority of ethical dilemmas, according to Cooper, about 80% or so that we face over the lifetime of a career, are really resolved at the moral rules level, where we simply look to a moral rule that we were taught as a child, either from our parents, our religious instructors, our friends, our family, our teachers, whatever. And we say, in most cases, I'm expected to be honest. Honesty is the best policy. So I'm willing to accept the consequences of that honesty because that's the moral rule that I feel personally is the most important. Or I should always be a good team player. Do nothing that upsets the apple cart, because by being a good team player, I'm personally rewarded and my organization is personally rewarded. About 95 to 96% of all ethical dilemmas are resolved at either the expressive or the moral rules level. And about 3.5 to 4.5% are really resolved at the ethical analysis level, where we begin to look for key exceptions to the moral rules that help govern our behavior and govern our lives. Yeah, it's always important to tell the truth, but I really just don't want to sleep on the couch tonight. So even though I absolutely hate that dress, I'm just going to say she looks great so we can go out and enjoy the evening together and move on with our lives together. So I looked for a justification for an exception to that moral rule that I have. Most likely in your profession, in your entire professional career, you will never ever face an ethical dilemma that requires us to engage in post-ethical level analysis. Here, I begin to question the very rationale for engaging in not only ethical behavior, but moral behavior. And typically, this is the area that is best left to philosophers and religious teachers and poets and artists and scholars, as it requires us to really begin to evaluate those moral rules that we have been kind of indoctrinated with from a societal as well as a very personal and intimate and maturation perspective. We can also employ a very straightforward process for resolving the ethical dilemma itself, beginning really with a definition of the problem. Here we need to collect as much information as possible, as well as relying upon our past experiences and our background in order to truly understand the various aspects of the ethical dilemma that we face. And once we've done that, once we've collected all the information possible, we can then begin to kind of develop as many different alternatives as possible. I could tell my significant other that, yep, the outfit looks great. And as a result, she's happy, I'm happy, and then we can kind of go on and enjoy the evening. Or I can just straight up tell her the truth and say, that's a nightmare, right? I have never seen a worse color on you than I'm seeing on you right now. And then from there begin to think about the potential consequences of that choice as well. Cooper frames this discussion of identifying alternatives as kind of bounded rationality. in that in order to be fully rational, we would have to list every single possibility and alternative, and then evaluate each individual alternative with every possible criteria. We simply don't have the time to do that. So what we do is we actually limit the scope of potential alternatives based upon our own previous experiences in similar circumstances. Once I've identified what I feel to be the most optimal or most feasible alternatives, I can then begin that evaluation process using a criteria, doing the least amount of damage, trying to create the most good for the most number of people, whatever criteria I want to use to evaluate each individual alternative. And once I've found a single alternative that meets the criteria that I've established, I then select that alternative and ultimately make the decision to resolve the conflict that I currently face. And once I've made the decision, it's then up to me as the individual to implement the decision. To say, this is the choice and the alternative that I'm going with because of the justification, that it's going to create the most good for the most number of people, that it's going to create the least amount of damage, that it protects the organization the most, or advances me personally as an individual the most. And I simply implement it. And once I've implemented, I then have to kind of create the rational loop and extend it back to the definition of the problem and simply evaluate it. Was the conflict between two equally good or two equally bad choices simply resolved to a degree that I'm comfortable with, and that meets the criteria that I've established and allows me to essentially engage in future operations and activities that are the expectations of me as an individual employer. This is a lot easier on paper than it is in practice because of all the external pressures that we face. Again, those other responsibilities, roles, and expectations we face as professionals in different organizations. But ultimately, it falls upon you as an individual to use this process to rationally work yourself through the various ethical dilemmas that you may face. And kind of with that general theoretical framework and separation and interdependency of ethics and morality, I'd now like to pass it on to our panel. I think Polly is going to speak next to talk about the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct and the expectation that the AICP and the APA has for you. Polly.
Is this working?
No.
Not really.
Is this dead? Yes, it's dead. Okay, well, I'm over here and I'm fine. 1 second. I can do the same turnaround. I'd like to just boil it down a little bit, because I'm not going to sit here and read you the Code of Ethics. That's boring and you can do it all by yourself. But what I usually start with when I do these sessions, you've probably all seen this wonderful picture of my grandson when he was just about sitting up in his little blue bathtub, and he had a little plastic book in his lap. He's got this shocked look on his face. Don't do anything that you wouldn't want your grandson to read about in the morning paper and be shocked. There's some very simple things to think about. Also, I think what was just occurring to me as Fred was talking about, when I met my late husband, he was a consultant to organized systems of healthcare delivery. And one of the things he did in his job was teach the marketing women how to dress. And he did go up to them and say, "This is not good on you." And he could do it because he had the expertise. And we as planners, if we're talking about issues in a community, we are the experts. And if we say, this isn't a real good idea, we have a responsibility to say that, and we can say that because we have the expertise to say that. Not because we think that the city councilman's stupid, even though he might be. So, there are 4 sections. You can, again, I'm not going to read the thing to you. We're serving the public. It's our responsibility to think as the public interest, not even the developer who's picking up the tab for your consulting. Our job as professional planners is to think about what's good for the public and the community. We're not going to lie. It always amazes me when I see a development proposal and the consultant's going on and on about how this won't create any traffic or it's not going to use any land, and you know, excuse me, but I think that's not real good thing to do. AICP code, we must adhere to. We're required to adhere to it. If you don't know whether or not you can, read it. If you can't, don't take the exam, don't bother, because we are required to adhere to it. As AICP, people can file a complaint with APA, and the head of APA, AICP, is responsible for going through what happened, who's responsible, and whether or not there's a violation of the Code of Ethics, and making a decision. You can lose your AICP. That's the worst thing that happens. You can get a letter that's private, you can get a letter that's public, or you can lose your certification. You can read. I'm not going to read it to you. But you can go and get an ethical ruling as well. If you have a question, you're thinking about filing a grievance, you can call APA and they'll talk to you about whether or not what someone else did or what you're thinking about doing is a violation of the code. You have help in making these decisions. There's the enforcement provisions. Executive director is typically the person involved in these things. They get investigated. The results are taken to the AICP commission. Decisions are made about whether or not you lose your certification. Private, public, dismissal from AICP. That's the list. And again, you can get formal or informal advice. If you have a question about your decision-making process, whether or not you should do something as an AICP, don't be shy. Get on the phone. Get good advice. There's no reason not to do that. And because you're AICP or a PDO, you're going to have a higher level of responsiveness from APA. On to
Good afternoon. I'm not going to try to put anybody to sleep, but it's going to be hard. My name's Ed Wines, for you who don't know me. You've already heard that AICP says it's required. Trouble is, APA is not required. There is no requirements, there are no process for adjudication, there's nothing in it. It is adopted by a lot of organizations who then attach rules and regulations as to how it is to be enforced. But from the standpoint of APA, there is nothing, it's just rules. Now, why that is, I don't understand it. The thing that really kicks you is AICP is required if you're an AICP member, you're required to follow APA rules and regulations, and ethical rules and regulations. But as just a regular individual who is a planner, not AICP, several years ago now, I was working for a community in northern Nevada. My wife and I had just bought a house, and right after the house was built, we moved in, the individual who bought the house came into the planning department office and said, I want to rezone a piece of property from residential to commercial, and I'm going to put a car wash, and I want to put a mini lube on it. Okay, it'll fit under commercial. So we went through the process. I knew the property very well. I was excited about seeing something being done with this piece of property in this area. So we got through the planning commission meeting. He got his approvals. And one of the planning commission members walked up to me and said, Ed, I think you are violating rules of ethics because you are giving this man more leeway and are easier on him than on other people in the same position. I looked at her and I said, well, I will take your idea under advisement, but thank you. But there's a caveat to this whole story. She was the director of a tri-county economic development agency who was trying to get all of this land rezoned to industrial or commercial so she could bring in industrial and commercial development. I just beat her to the punch. So was I in a conflict? Did I have an ethical problem? Or was it something that was perceived by her? In my mind, and even to today, I think that it was something perceived by her, not by me. I had nothing to do with it. So, there are situations where somebody may say something to you or accuse you of an ethical violation, but if they were to look into the background of it and all the way through it, they would find that it's probably not as much of a problem as they say. There are situations where it can be, but there are a lot of situations where it's really not as much as we think it is. So I'm going to go sit down, and I'm going to let Mike finish up with this thing.
Just to make sure that you get some of the information. But what Ed has basically said, it's a guide. And it does have aspirational and directional guide. Fred, I know we printed off some material.
Oh, let me go get that.
Thank you. Much of this presentation is also printed out. You can pick it up. Okay, Nevada's Code of Ethical Standards. We've gone from voluntary compliance and some, I guess, punishment by the AICP Commission and its staff. Now we're to the realm of law. As I mentioned earlier, if you are a public official, if you work for a public agency, or you work for a public agency under the color of law in the sense of being a consultant but acting on behalf of that, you are required, and I can't emphasize this enough, you are required to comply with the statements and the material that we're going to go through. So, who does this apply to? Oh hell, you can hear me. These are the folks in which the requirements are, and NRS 281A is your reference. It's a fairly detailed piece of legislation, and it does change on a biennial basis, so you should look at this. This is the latest that we have from the 2015 session. And for those of you working in the private sector, it's important that you understand that last point. Who does this not apply to? Probably no real surprise. I mean, the bar in the state of Nevada covers most of judicial judges, attorneys, those kind of folks. Any board or commission or anybody that is advisory and does not have any kind of financial responsibility in the sense of making a decision or recommendation. I'm not sure I know of any board, commission, or other body that typically is a consultant to do that on one time or another. So planning commissions, boards of adjustment often are sent budgets, and they're required to make those. GIDs are covered, and again, the only exception is, and I don't know a GID that doesn't make a budget or an expenditure decision, nevertheless, for some reason the law is written this way. And the county health department's health officer is covered under an entirely different section of the law. The 10 do-nots that we're going to list here were developed by the attorney that was the chief civil attorney for Washington County for many, many years. He worked with the state legislature in the capacity of representing both Washington County and, interestingly enough, the Southern Nevada Home Builders Association. I think some of these are pretty clear, but they are worthwhile considering as you look at those ethical issues that Fred talked about and how they fall within the context of the law. And some of these are a little bit borderline in some instances. The municipal policy is extremely important. I actually fired an employee because of the fact that she was spending about 6 hours a day using the county's computer to buy stuff. Number 9, important also to understand, especially if you are at the point where you've been offered a job by another company or by a private firm if you're working in the public sector, and or you are thinking about moving on and you make some suggestions. And well, they weren't serious. Well, they did. Here's some definitions that you need to be aware of. And you'll notice the list. It's fairly extensive. And they have expanded, I think, as social relationships have expanded beyond just the traditional husband and wife who are married and their current extended family. And I like the last one, commitment, interest, relations, substantially similar to the above, which, as we will get into this a little bit later, will make basically is a decision made by the Ethics Commission.
What's the third degree of consanguinity?
That would be
Nieces and nephews.
cousin, I think.
Cousin?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be your cousin. Your first cousin.
First cousin.
And you add this. I want to make it clear that the Nevada Commission on Ethics and even the State Attorney General's office, typically takes the position when it comes to, upholding these legal standards of education first, punishment last. And it's understood that especially in more rural communities with significantly lower populations and many more familial connections, that it may be almost impossible to uphold these separations in the performance of your official duty. If you look at counties again like Eureka County with a population of 2,000 people, there are really only 10 families in the entire county. And it becomes very difficult to maintain quorum
for elected and appointed officials if they're constantly having to recuse themselves on decisions that may have a direct or indirect impact on a third or fewer removed family member. You know, and that goes for staff as well, where the county government or government entity may actually be the largest employer within that jurisdiction. It's going to be very difficult for individuals to execute their authority and their official responsibilities, but yet not run afoul of these responsibilities. And in those particular cases, the Attorney General's Office of the State of Nevada and the Nevada Commission on Ethics not wanting to speak with them, but putting this in the context that both organizations and entities have helped Mike and I through the Nevada Leadership Program develop this material, that as long as you make a good faith effort to disclose the familial relationship, so that, you know, the decision that you made is made in as transparent and a responsible and accountable way as possible, you can still execute your responsibilities, while at least in terms of the letter of the law, potentially violate that legal standard. So it's important to note that, especially in a state like Nevada, you know, that has so many different rural communities and where the familial ties are very, very close and almost impossible to avoid.
That's great, thank you. These are the definitions that you need to be aware of. What is the definition of pecuniary interest? What is the definition of an interested person? Educational information, this came out of the 2015 legislature. It talks more about public officials in the sense of elected and candidates, but I find it kind of odd about how it defines what a particular type of trip might be and how it would be authorized and who can take it and what kind of violation would be. We bring this to your attention because in many instances, especially in more rural settings, where you may be a contract planner or you may be there as a consultant representing a client but become aware of this, again, you have some responsibility of making sure that someone is made aware of the potential conflict or the potential violation, so that in fact it doesn't get to the point where, as Polly said, you know, you used to say, you know, you wanted to have clean underwear if you got hit by a car, so your mother wasn't there. Excuse me. Talks about anything of value, pretty extensive identification of anything of value. My father-in-law was the city manager of Reno during the 1960s, and it was not uncommon at Christmas time to have lots and lots of booze delivered to his office. And in fact, I never, in the 45 years that I've been married to my wife, ever had to buy a bottle of liquor because of the stock that he had. That kind of thing just is not supposed to happen anymore, and hopefully typically does not happen. But you can see how things have gone from a very broad kind of acceptance of that to a very narrow that. And I think primarily it's because some bad apples have done some things that the State Ethics Commission and the state legislature felt need to be taken care of.
That said, I'll add kind of the devil's advocate of that. Again, there is an understanding from, you know, again, the Attorney General's Office of the State of Nevada and the Commission on Ethics, that it's important for individuals working in the public sector to maintain positive relationships with individuals in their community, and that a refusal, you know, of the gift basket around the holidays may actually impede or retard the ability of the official to maintain a positive working relationship with members in their community. And what has typically been advised by both the Attorney General's Office as well as the State Commission on Ethics is that your organization should develop a written and established and adopted policy saying that no member of the organization can accept anything that cannot be divisible amongst all the individuals within the organization. So if you're getting the holiday gift basket, right, not uncommon for that to happen, instead of you taking the holiday gift basket home for yourself, you take it to the break room and you put it on the break room table and you say, come on, come on. That way you are essentially separating the connection between you executing your official duties and receiving that gift by essentially using that divisible policy. And it falls upon the responsibility of you, the administrator or elected official, to communicate that policy to external stakeholders. And if they show up with a pair of baseball tickets to go to the game, obviously you can't divide that amongst the organization. It's your responsibility in that case to refuse by simply stating what the policy of the organization is. And by having the written and adopted policy in place, it kind of can shield you, from having to find yourself in an uncomfortable position of saying, well, I really shouldn't, but I don't want to hurt your feelings. So that's why it's the recommendation of the Commission on Ethics and the Attorney General's Office that if you don't have a policy, an official policy like that in place, that you work with your legal counsel and elected officials and essentially department heads and directors to develop that policy and then communicate that policy to the public.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's very typical in China.
Yeah, so what would be?
Well, in that particular case, I think you have to make sure that the circumstances are disclosed as to why that occurred. And that, as you said, is a cultural, because I went to China as an AICP representative and was given gifts by the representatives of the Chinese government. I guess in gratitude for me coming to China. I thought the fact they sent me there was okay. And when I got back, I explained to the commission that these were gifts that had been provided to me as a cultural situation. So in that particular case, again, try to go back to the fact that you disclose the circumstances under which something like that, because you may not want to offend.
And it's important to understand, from the Attorney General's perspective and the Commission on Ethics perspective, the responsibility to engage in the behavior, the pay to play, the gifts for service.
Right.
The responsibility to break the connection is not on the giver of the gift, it's on the receiver of the gift. So if I'm the planning director, of a major, city in Nevada, and as part of that, and I have economic development responsibilities, and I'm trying to recruit major businesses from Asia, potentially the Middle East, where the culture is and the expectation is there's the social building a relationship, and then we get down to business. It's acceptable, to respect that from the position of the Commission and the Attorney General's Office and accept the gift. But then again, there is the expectation on the receiver of the gift that you have some sort of divisionable policy where, instead of me keeping the, bottle of Johnny Walker Blue, or, a symbol, a physical, tangible gift, representative of their culture, that I could potentially, donate it to the organization. Say it's a, I don't know, a ceremonial headdress, right? That serves really no practical purpose from the position of the organization, but the gift has been given to me. I can receive that gift on behalf of the city or the county, and then it becomes the property of the city and the county, and then through the public policy process determine what to do it. Give it to a museum, put it on display, in the main hall. This actually comes up a lot, at the federal level and the expectation of federal employees who work overseas. So say when the President of the United States is receiving foreign dignitaries, not uncommon for them to provide gifts. The President of the United States doesn't get to keep that gift upon the end of their term. It becomes the property of the people of the United States and is usually handed over to the Smithsonian and then inventoried, and it becomes part of the public property. Many jurisdictions, I know Los Angeles City.
I really want to move through a lot of this stuff, and I apologize. But, I think he makes a good point that there is a process that you need to acknowledge. Disclosure, you need to identify what the specific conflict is and what the relationship is. Not one of these, I've got a conflict. That doesn't work anymore. For those of you who advise public bodies, it needs to be made to the chair. But if you are a staff member, it's made to your supervisor. If you're the director of the department, then it's made probably either to the county manager or the city manager, or if you have no manager like that, then it would be to the chief elected official. Now, voting and abstaining is important again because too often, we've all had this experience where we have a member of the public body who doesn't want to vote because they don't want to make a decision. And essentially, the ethics law says, listen, you know, you got elected or you got appointed to participate and vote, and you need to really kind of exercise an independent judgment of a reasonable man, and whether you be materially affected by the conflict. Oftentimes, we find that ain't going to happen. And then these are some of the recommendations, or actually, well, more of the recommendations of after disclosing a conflict. You know, if not clear conflict, participate and vote. Don't be afraid to explain that. I may have a conflict, but I think I'm okay in voting. In conflict, abstain and leave. And you'd be surprised how many times Fred and I have gone to, made this presentation, and someone says, why do I have to leave? Well, because even body language can indicate a preference or a decision. So, now, it's important that you understand, especially if you're a public
Elected body.
member, that a quorum is required unless it's an elected board, and then it has to be a quorum of the entire board. So, our Board of County Commissioners is 5 members, yours is 7. If you only have 4 members and one of them abstains, you're SOL. So. Now, these are expensive. These are civil penalties for violations. Be aware of them. I think we find end results like it's like $55,000 or $60,000 if you violate all of this. So you can get opinions, and some of these are already on the website. You understand though that a third party can make a complaint, and in both instances there will be an investigation. Just some recommendations. I think most of you've probably gone through this process enough. You know, when in doubt, ask, and ask. If you abide by the opinion, no willful violation. There's a little bit of a wrinkle here though, and that is that the request has to be made before the decision, not afterwards. So.
And the caveat, of course, is if you get an opinion and you operate opposite of that opinion, you can be charged with a willful violation.
Absolutely.
You know, but you cannot be charged with a willful violation if you follow the advice of legal counsel and then the Commission on Ethics or the Attorney General's office finds that you are in violation of the State Code of Administrative Ethics. There, they will simply ask for corrective action as opposed to the civil penalties and potentially criminal penalties if you've really stepped over the line.
And so these are some of the responsibilities of the Nevada State Ethics Commission. And again, the bottom line, violations not willful to obtain legal counsel advice, is not contrary to prior Ethics Commission opinions, and I need to add to that, it needs to be made, provided to you before you make the decision, not afterwards. Now, I'm going to let Fred kind of run you through a few exercises because we want to put your brains to work and to make you feel like you really are ethical. Now, when you retire, you automatically become ethical.
We'll really kind of, in the interest of time, really kind of throw this up to the group to decide so we can maybe reach some consensus on how to resolve to kind of resolve the ethical dilemmas. So here we have an example of you being a planner, a professional practicing planner, working for a relatively small town that has, for the most part, an outdated zoning ordinance and official zoning map. So you've had one in place, unfortunately it's expired, and now you kind of are getting in the process of redrafting it and presenting that to the town's planning commission or governing body that's responsible for evaluating the revised plan.
In this particular case, this is done with no public or media in attendance, yet one of the members of the Planning or Commission has articulated a desire, kind of a random thought going through their head, that they want to change the zoning designation on a property that that individual planning commissioner owns. He simply takes out a pen and starts scribbling, essentially, on your new zoning maps, on the draft zoning map from a single-family residential zoning to a commercial zoning. And kind of to add to that, none of the other planning commission members in attendance say or do anything. And they essentially either put their head in the sand or they're just like, oh, whatever, you know, it's Billy, Billy's gonna do what he wants, and for the sake of moving things along, we'll just kind of, you know, go on to the next issue. If you are the planning director or the individual responsible for that redraft, how would you respond to this individual planning commissioner's proposal?
I think under NRS in the old days, that would be illegal because you are having a meeting of a group that can take a vote on this ultimately when it comes up. You can't have anything near a quorum without having a public meeting, having a thing publicly announced and agended.
All right, so we may be, in this particular case, running afoul of what we consider to be the moral or ethical minimum in terms of the expectation of the public meeting process. The legal process, right? Which we consider as a moral and ethical minimum. So if that's the case, and you feel that we're kind of running afoul of the open meeting law and the process that we've set forward for this type of deliberative effort, what do you do as the planning director? What would your resolution and solution be?
There's a process for changing the ordinance in the map, and it's just the beginning. We haven't had any official action, public meetings or public hearings on it. When we do, we can examine the petition to change.
Yeah,
Part of the process.
probably in this particular case, what you'd want to do is probably perform the role more of educator than planning director or planner in this particular case, and actually take the time to inform the commissioner on what the actual process is. You know, from my perspective, I feel for elected and appointed officials in this state. They have some of the hardest jobs because they are elected from the citizenry, right? They don't come to the decision-making process with the same level of expertise, knowledge, and training that most of us in this room does. So they're elected or appointed to a board, and the first thing we do with them is give them a 700-page document and say, go ahead and start making important decisions, right? And live up to the expectation of the public that may have voted you in or the elected body that appointed to them. And there becomes an ethical obligation and responsibility of us, the technical bureaucrats, the experts, to provide that education to the appointed or elected official to ensure that that public process of deliberation is upheld and followed to within the organization itself.
So let's throw a wrinkle in there. Let's just assume that in reality, what this commissioner has asked for is spot zoning. And that under no circumstances would it actually ever be approved. I mean, spot zoning actually, there are some attorneys who will tell you that's illegal in the state of Nevada to do spot zoning under that. So now what are you going to do? Do you really want to tell Planning, well, we've got a process by which you can do this, but then you're going to end up at the next meeting saying, hey, sorry, sport, can't do it anyway.
I didn't say there was a process where you could have spot zoning, even I could see it's spot zoning, and I'm retired.
Well, would you advise about that?
But I would say there's a process for examining your change, and when you adopt the ordinance in the map, we'll examine what you want to do under that process.
Okay.
I'm thinking too, one of the things that I've done instead of trying to get everybody together and hold a public meeting to go over something when you just want input, is sit down with the planning commissioners one at a time.
Right. That way you're not in violation of the open meeting law that requires once you have a quorum.
As long as you don't do serial communication.
And that planning commissioner, I want this changed, you can say, we will take it under advisement. If other people believe that it should be, then we'll
Right.
but not to try to have a public meeting without the public.
Great, and it is also important to take into context, or into consideration, the context of this exercise. This exercise is specific about a small town. right? We're not talking about, you know, a major urban center like Reno or Sparks or Carson City or Las Vegas or Henderson, where it's easy to identify what spot zoning is. But if you look at like the town of Eureka, you know, a population of only about 650 individuals, and you're only talking about maybe 150 to 160 individual parcels. From the outside, the changing of one parcel from commercial to residential or residential to commercial might look like spot zoning. But in the context of that one parcel as a percentage of all the parcels that exist in that relatively small environment may not breach the standard that we have for spot zoning.
No. Spot zoning is spot zoning. Period, paragraph, end of transmission. We're gonna argue about variances?
It's a little trickier, especially in the smaller communities.
Well,
And
you've got 600 people with guns outside the room.
Okay, I like that.
Good point there, but you know, as we tend to find in some of the smaller communities, there's not good separation between residential and commercial areas. They're intermixed with each other. You know, if you look at Main Street, you know, downtown Eureka, you know, along US Highway 50, you could have a series of commercial properties and then have one residential property and then a series of commercial properties after that.
And have a public hearing and decide how you want to plan and zone for the area.
Right,
Let the public decide.
And that's when Polly's advice comes into play, is to almost kind of stop the process and meet with the individual who has that individual concern, and then begin the public process anew in order to assure that you don't run afoul of the public process. But the addressing of that particular issue has to be done in, again, the context of that individual situation. Kind of moving right along, to kind of consider some of the relevant AICP code provisions for this particular situation. No idea why it's doing that again. 2B and 2C are applicable in this case in that we want to accept the client's decision unless illegal. So that should be the first standard that we apply. Are we violating that moral and ethical minimum that is established by the appropriate laws? In this particular context in Nevada, it would be existing Nevada Revised Statute chapters or chapter that applies to spot zoning, as well as the open meeting law and potentially the Code of Administrative Ethics. We also want to think about 2C in this case, the appearance of a conflict of interest. Do you have an existing personal relationship, a familial relationship with this individual planning commissioner? And again, in a smaller community, a smaller town, you might have that existing family or personal relationship, which would essentially require you again to disclose the potential conflict and what that means kind of moving forward. Here we can also kind of point to the general rule of conduct, number 2, of illegal or unethical conduct, and we would encourage you to consult rules of conduct number 2 in order to provide some guidance of how to resolve it. And again, the recommendations here from the panel is 1, immediately identify to the commissioner that there may be a potential problem with the public meeting process, and then maybe go one step forward to be the educator, to teach the commission of what the process is, what laws may be violated, and maybe even going one step further, as long as you don't engage in serial communication, to have the one-on-one discussion with each individual commissioner, and then bring the information forward to the public hearing so that you can have a proper publicly noticed meeting and decision-making process that doesn't violate either the open meeting laws or these individual principles or the rule of conduct itself. Again, what will be important here is to also involve legal counsel. Even for the Planning Commission, for a county like Eureka, the District Attorney's Office is going to be the official legal counsel for the Planning Commission and the planning staff. And it's very important to engage your legal counsel, whoever that is for a municipality or county, as early on in the process to ensure that you don't run afoul of applicable NRS statutes and even potential municipal or county ordinances.
Well, not wanting to offend any attorney, but I will tell you that, and I suspect many of you will agree, there are very few attorneys in this state who really understand planning. And that in many instances, and in some instances, there will be no attorney at these kinds of meetings. So, you know, it's clear that it's important to understand the law as well as the ethical considerations.
I think the way you deal with that, because no attorney is going to accept a layman's opinion about planning law, regardless of how many.
Actually, I worked with a few attorneys that did.
Huh?
I worked with a few attorneys that actually recognized that they didn't know that much about planning.
Well, I'd say you're lucky, but the issue is, the whole issue is here with planning, is that it's a process. And if you move them into the process arena, then they have time to learn, and you have time to teach. But attorneys, if they're really interested in being supportive attorneys, will learn and they'll work through that process.
Very good.
And that's where you need to keep pushing people, is back to the process, not the procedures, the process. The procedures is what I was yelling at you about. And you're right, they do intermingle, but it's the process you move them to.
It is a challenge, and again, I know we're right up at the time, so I don't know if we can get another scenario in, but you know, I think what's very important to kind of be the takeaway from this, from the perspective of the APA, the AICP, as well as the State Attorney General's Office and the Nevada Commission on Ethics, is that those four groups are not looking to be punitive. They're looking to be educational in their approach to ensure that you as a practicing official, be it elected, appointed, or in the bureaucracy as professional staff, be it public sector or private sector, don't run afoul of the existing standards that we have for you. You know, in the presentation itself, and at some point after this conference, this material will all be up on the Nevada APA website as well as the Nevada Leadership Program's website. The information, all of this is available to you at no charge. You can go to the Commission on Ethics website, you can go to the District Attorney, you can go to the Attorney General's Office, you can go to AICP and APA and ask for advice. If you find yourself in a position where you really feel that you're in that position to choose between two bad or two equally good choices, reach out to individuals at the AICP, the APA, the District Attorney, your District Attorney's Office or City Attorney's Office, the Attorney General's Office, or the Commission on Ethics, and simply ask for advice on how to resolve the conflict so you don't run afoul. That becomes the critical approach. In addition to this presentation that we'll put up on the website, we'll also put up a copy of the Code of Administrative Ethics that the state of Nevada has. Again, it's made to you free of charge by the Commission on Ethics, and I really encourage you to look at it as well as the various free resources that are provided for all these organizations. Before we leave, are there any questions, comments, ideas? You're just happy to get your 1.5 credits in AICP Ethics? Cheryl run the party, you can't leave now.
I run the party. I just want to say one of my favorite quotes that I've learned from my years of planning is, Commissioner told me that he was not circumventing the code, he found a loophole and he was exploiting it.
Yeah.